The Galactic Defense Institute, perched on the crystalline moon of Helix Prime, like a monument to bureaucratic efficiency, its spires gleaming with the sort of architectural smugness that screamed, "We know better than everyone else." For 3 centuries, this hallowed institution had churned out military officers with the reliability of a factory producing identical widgets, each one polished to the same gleaming standard of tactical predictability. The Institute's admissions board took particular pride in their rigorous selection process, which filtered candidates through a series of tests designed by the greatest military minds in the galaxy. These minds coincidentally all happened to think exactly alike, a feature, not a bug, according to the curriculum designers. Why muddy the waters with diverse perspectives when you could have beautiful crystalline conformity? Within the Institute's marble halls, 4 major species dominated the student body. The Vorthak, with their cybernetic implants and perfect recall, approached warfare like a chess match played at light speed. The Zalari floated through corridors in their environmental suits, their collective consciousness allowing them to coordinate fleet movements with hive mind precision. The Korath stomped around on 6 legs, their warrior culture treating space combat as an extension of their ancient gladiatorial traditions, just with bigger explosions. And finally, scattered among these paragons of military evolution, were the humans. Oh, the human, poor, confused, chaotic humans. Most human cadets at least tried to emulate their alien classmates, adopting Vorthak analytical methods or mimicking Zalari coordination protocols. They studied the approved texts, memorized the established formations, and generally attempted to blend into the cosmic military machine with varying degrees of success. This was considered progress by the faculty, who viewed human unpredictability as a character flaw to be corrected rather than a tactical asset to be cultivated. Then there was Cadet Hayes. If the Institute was a temple to military orthodoxy, Hayes was the guy in the back row asking why everyone was worshipping in the first place. While his classmates absorbed lessons on quantum battlefield theory and gravitational warfare dynamics, Hayes could be found in the library's dusty archives, poring over ancient human military texts with the sort of obsessive fascination usually reserved for stamp collecting or conspiracy theory. Horatio Nelson, he'd mutter to himself, completely ignoring the sneers from passing Vorthak cadets. Now there was someone who understood the value of breaking formation. His instructors found this behavior baffling, then annoying, then finally just embarrassing. Commander Zethvar, a Vorthak with more processing cores than most starships, had given up trying to explain why studying pre-spaceflight naval battles was fundamentally irrelevant to modern warfare. The commander's cybernetic eye would twitch whenever Hayes raised his hand, which happened with distressing frequency. "But sir," Hayes had asked during one particularly painful strategy seminar, "what if we're thinking about this all wrong? What if we're thinking about this all wrong? What if predictability is actually a weakness?" The lecture hall had erupted in what passed for alien laughter. Vorthak cadets processed the humor through their neural networks and emitted synchronized clicking sounds. The Zalari students rippled with collective amusement, their shared consciousness finding the concept delightfully absurd. Even the usually stoic Korath had stamped their feet in appreciation of such spectacular ignorance. Commander Zethvar's response had been swift and devastating. "Cadet Hayes, warfare is mathematics. Variables are calculated, probability is assessed, outcomes determined. Unpredictability is simply another word for incompetence." Hayes had nodded thoughtfully, as if genuinely considering this wisdom, then asked, "So what happens when the math is wrong?" The silence that followed was the kind of uncomfortable quiet that settles over a room when someone asks an exceptionally stupid question with complete sincerity. You could practically hear neural processes overheating as every alien in the room tried to compute how mathematics could be wrong. This pattern repeated itself throughout Hayes's academy career. While other cadets excelled in simulation after simulation, Hayes consistently ranked at the bottom of every tactical exercise. He couldn't execute a proper Vorthak pincer movement to save his life. His attempts at Zalari swarm coordination looked like a traffic accident in slow motion. When asked to demonstrate Korath breakthrough tactics, he somehow managed to get his own simulated fleet confused about which direction they were supposed to be attacked. His personal combat scores were equally dismal. Hayes moved through zero-gravity training like he was swimming through molasses, his reflexes apparently calibrated for some primitive planet where things fell down instead of floating around. His marksmanship instructors had given up trying to improve his accuracy with standard energy weapons, though they noted with puzzled amusement that he showed surprising proficiency with kinetic projectile weapons, a skill about as useful in modern warfare as knowing how to sharpen a stick. The final straw came during the Grand Strategy Examination, the capstone test that determined final rankings before graduation. Cadets were presented with a classic scenario: defend a vital system against overwhelming odds using standard fleet formations and approved tactical doctrine. The solution was obvious to anyone who had paid attention during their 4 years of instruction. Hayes looked at the problem, looked at the expected answer, and submitted something that made his examiners wonder if he'd suffered some kind of neurological episode. Instead of the textbook defensive screen formation, he proposed something he called controlled chaos. Rather than engaging the enemy fleet in a proper line of battle, he suggested breaking his forces into seemingly random groups, each operating independently with no apparent coordination. His battle plan read like the fever dream of someone who had confused warfare with interpretive dance. The examining board spent 3 days trying to figure out what Hayes had been thinking. Commander Zethvar ran the strategy through every tactical analysis program in the Institute's database. Each simulation ended the same way: catastrophic defeat for Hayes's forces within the first hour of engagement. Perhaps, suggested Professor Yilthara, a Zalari whose collective wisdom spanned 12 bodies, the human simply doesn't understand the fundamental principles of space combat. Or, added General Thokmar, a scarred Korath veteran, he's operating on some level of strategic thinking, so primitive that our analysis systems cannot process it. They decided it was probably both. Hayes received his final ranking 3 days before graduation, dead last, with a performance rating that suggested he might be better suited for civilian logistics work, or possibly professional comedy. The commandant's office prepared a gentle rejection letter, the kind usually reserved for candidates who showed up to the academy by accident. But Hayes didn't seem particularly bothered by his spectacular failure. While other cadets prepared for their commissioning ceremonies and first assignments to prestigious fleet commands, he continued his peculiar research, diving deeper into human military history with the dedication of an archaeologist, uncovering lost civilization. Trafalgar, he'd whisper to himself, studying battle maps that meant nothing to anyone else in the galaxy. Midway, Salamis. They all thought they knew what they were doing, right up until they didn't. His classmates had long since stopped paying attention to his muttering. Hayes had become background noise, a curiosity that would soon be forgotten once they all moved on to their real careers. The Vorthak cadets calculated their probable career trajectories with mechanical precision. The Zalari shared dreams of coordinated fleet movements across star systems. The Korath planned glorious battles against worthy enemies. None of them imagined that within a year they would be studying recordings of Hayes's tactics with the same obsessive intensity he had once devoted to ancient human naval battles. None of them suspected that the worst cadet in academy history was about to rewrite every tactical manual in the galaxy. After all, the math said it was impossible. The emergency klaxons that shrieked through the Institute's corridors at 0347 hours carried a particular quality of panic that even the most advanced alien vocal cords couldn't quite replicate. It was the sound of very important people suddenly realizing that all their careful planning might have missed something rather significant. Admiral Cortex, the Institute's commandant, materialized in the war room with the sort of urgency that suggested his morning meditation had been rudely interrupted by the prospect of galactic annihilation. Around him, holographic displays painted a picture that would have been beautiful if it weren't so thoroughly terrifying. A massive enemy armada, designation unknown, approaching the core systems with the inexorable patience of a cosmic tax collector. How many ships? Cortex demanded, his 4 eyes independently tracking different data streams while his secondary brain calculated logistics. Conservative estimate places their fleet strength at 12,000 vessels, reported Commander Zethvar, his cybernetic implants cycling through threat assessments with mechanical efficiency. Analysis suggests Devourers, the hive mind collective that consumed the Outer Rim colonies last century. The war room fell silent except for the gentle humming of processors and the occasional bubble of a Zalari collective having what passed for a nervous breakdown. The Devourers weren't just another hostile species, they were efficiency incarnate, a gestalt intelligence that treated warfare like a particularly engaging puzzle game. They didn't conquer worlds so much as solve them, reducing entire civilizations to their component resources with mathematical precision. Time to impact, Cortex asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't improve his day. 72 hours until they reached the Helix system. Another 48 to the core worlds after that, Zethvar reported with the clinical detachment of someone delivering a weather forecast. All active fleet elements are currently engaged in the Spiral campaign. Minimum response time 96 hours. The math was brutally simple. The cavalry wouldn't arrive until after the town had been thoroughly pillaged and possibly redecorated according to alien aesthetic principle. What do we have available? Cortex asked, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who suspected the answer would involve cadets, reservists, and possibly janitors pressed into military service. Mothballed human vessels in the Titan shipyards, Commander Zethvar replied, pulling up schematics that looked like they'd been designed by someone with a peculiar fondness for geometric brutality. 68 ships of various classes, all functional but primitive. Oh yes, the human reserve fleet. 40-year-old vessels that had been retired not because they were broken, but because they operated on principles that modern military doctrine considered quaint. They were built by humans, for humans, which meant they featured such antiquated concepts as manual controls, independent command structures, and the ability to function without constant communication with a central command network. Crew availability. Cortex continued his descent into logistical despair. Skeleton crews only. Most qualified personnel are with the main fleet. Zethvar paused, his processors apparently struggling with the next bit of information. We do have the recent academy graduate, the newly minted officers currently scattered across the galaxy, bright-eyed and eager to apply 4 years of theoretical education to the messy reality of interstellar warfare. Unfortunately, they were also currently several star systems away and moving in the wrong direction at substantial fractions of light speed. And the current class? Cortex asked with the tone of someone scraping the bottom of a very deep barrel. Final examinations completed, but not yet commissioned. Technically still cadets. Zethvar's optical sensors flickered in what might have been embarrassing. Current class ranking shows standard distribution. Top percentile dominated by Vorthek analytical specialists. Strong Zalari coordination candidates. Cadet tactical excellence as expected. And the humans. The usual statistical noise, sir. Though there is one anomaly. Admiral Cortex's 4 eyes converged on his subordinate with the focused intensity of someone who had learned to be suspicious of the word anomaly when applied to humans. Elaborate. Cadet Hayes, ranked last in class, consistently failed all standard tactical assessments. Zethvar paused, his processors apparently running into some sort of logical contradiction. His simulation results are difficult to categorize, meaning his tactics consistently resulted in fleet destruction, but the analysis programs couldn't determine why. His strategies violated every established principle of space combat, yet the failure modes were unpredictable. Admiral Cortex processed this information with the weary experience of someone who had dealt with human unpredictability for longer than he cared to remember. Humans had a gift for creating problems that didn't fit into neat categories, usually by approaching situations from angles that more logical species hadn't thought to consider. Where is this Hayes now? Library archives, sir. Research section. He's been there for the past 18 hours apparently studying. Zethvar's optical sensors dimmed slightly. Pre-spaceflight human naval warfare. The war room's atmosphere shifted from panic to the peculiar sort of cosmic despair that settles over military professionals when they realize their best option involves putting trust in someone who spent graduation week reading about wooden sailing ships. Sir, interrupted Lieutenant Korth, a young Korith, whose enthusiasm hadn't yet been tempered by experience. Surely we're considering everything, Lieutenant. Admiral Cortex replied with the tone of someone who had just realized that everything included options that would have been dismissed as comedy material under normal circumstances. The Devourers will be here in 72 hours. Our best fleets are too far away to help. Our reserve consists of obsolete human vessels that require manual operation. He paused, his 4 eyes focusing on a holographic display showing the enemy fleet's relentless approach. And our only available commander is a cadet who thinks space warfare should be conducted like an ancient naval battle. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that occurs when experienced military professionals collectively realize that their carefully constructed reality is about to be tested by someone who apparently missed the memo about how things were supposed to work. Contact Cadet Hayes, Admiral Cortex finally ordered, his voice carrying the resignation of someone who had just decided to bet the galaxy on a very long shot. Tell him we have a job for him. In the archives below,
Hayes looked up from a particularly fascinating account of naval tactics during Earth's ancient wars, completely unaware that he was about to become either the galaxy's greatest hero or its most spectacular failure. The math still said it was impossible, but the math was about to meet reality.
68 hours after receiving the most reluctant promotion in galactic history, Hayes found himself standing on the bridge of the UGS Defiance, a human cruiser that had been built during an era when starship designers apparently believed that bigger buttons and more manual controls were the height of technological sophistication. Around him, skeletal crews of academy washouts, maintenance personnel, and volunteers who had clearly misunderstood what they were signing up for, prepared for what every tactical analysis suggested would be a very brief and educational experience in applied physics. The enemy fleet hung in space like a geometric nightmare. 12,000 vessels arranged in perfect mathematical formations that hurt to look at directly. The Devourers had approached the Helix system with all the subtlety of a cosmic steamroller, their crystalline ships gleaming with a sort of pristine efficiency that spoke of a species that had optimized warfare down to an exact science. "Sir," reported Ensign Park, a Korean woman who had volunteered for this mission after apparently deciding that a normal life expectancy was overrated, "enemy fleet is maintaining standard approach formation. Analysis indicates they're treating us as a minor obstacle." Hayes nodded, studying the tactical display with the calm expression of someone who either had a brilliant plan or had achieved a state of zen-like acceptance of his impending doom. "How many ships do they have in their vanguard?" "Approximately 800 vessels. Standard Devourer doctrine calls for overwhelming local resistance with superior numbers, then proceeding to consume planetary resources, while the main fleet secures orbital space." "And they're all moving together?" "Yes, sir. Perfect coordination as expected from a hive-mind collective." Hayes smiled, and several bridge crew members felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. It was the sort of smile that suggested someone had just realized something that probably should have been obvious but somehow wasn't. "Signal the fleet," Hayes ordered, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to have appeared from nowhere. "All ships are to break formation immediately. I want complete dispersal. No two vessels within 10,000 kilometers of each other." The communications officer, a grizzled human veteran named Chen who had come out of retirement for what he'd assumed would be a ceremonial last stand, stared at Hayes with the expression of someone who thought he might have misheard something important. "Sir, break formation. The enemy is approaching in overwhelming force. Standard doctrine calls for concentration of firepower and coordinated defense." "Standard doctrine," Hayes replied, pulling up holographic displays that showed ancient Earth naval battles with the sort of reverence usually reserved for religious texts, "assumes the enemy knows what we're going to do, but what if they don't?" Across the fleet, human captains received orders that violated every principle they'd learned about space combat. Instead of forming defensive screens or coordinated battle lines, they were told to scatter like startled fish, each ship operating independently with no apparent tactical coordination. Several captains requested clarification, assuming there had been some sort of communications error. Hayes confirmed the orders personally, adding instructions that sounded like they'd been translated from a foreign language by someone who only partially understood military terminology. The Devourer Vanguard encountered this formation with the sort of confusion that occurs when a perfectly calibrated machine suddenly encounters a variable it hasn't been programmed to handle. Their tactical analysis systems, honed over centuries of efficient conquest, processed the human disposition and returned error messages. The humans weren't arranged in any recognizable pattern. They weren't concentrating their firepower or establishing overlapping fields of fire. They weren't even moving in the same direction. From the Devourer perspective, it looked like the human fleet had suffered some sort of catastrophic command failure, and was now wandering around space, with no apparent purpose. "Target priority unclear," reported the Devourer Tactical Collective, their shared consciousness rippling with uncertainty. "Human vessels display no coherent strategy. Recommend standard engagement protocols." But standard engagement protocols assumed the enemy would behave like an enemy. The human ships weren't presenting targets so much as creating a three-dimensional puzzle that the Devourer tactical systems couldn't solve efficiently. Every time the alien vessels moved to engage one human ship, two others would appear from unexpected angles, striking with hit-and-run tactics that disappeared before effective retaliation could be organized. Hayes watched the tactical display like a conductor observing an orchestra, occasionally issuing orders that sounded more like suggestions than military commands. Yorktown, there's a nice cluster of enemy escorts at bearing 27 Mark 5. Why don't you go introduce yourself? Saratoga, I see you've got some friends following you. Might want to lead them past the Hampton Roads. I think Captain Williams has something for them. The enemy's perfect formations began to develop cracks as individual devourer vessels found themselves pulled out of position, chasing human ships that danced just outside effective weapons range before vanishing behind asteroids, debris fields, or other human vessels that appeared from nowhere like cosmic jack-in-the-boxes. Sir, Ensign Park reported, her voice carrying a note of disbelief that suggested she was having trouble processing what she was seeing. The enemy fleet is fragmenting. Their coordination algorithms appear to be overloading. Hayes nodded as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Hive minds are efficient, but they assume rational opposition. When faced with apparent chaos, they try to find the pattern. The more chaos you give them, the harder they work to solve a puzzle that doesn't actually exist. On the tactical display, the Devourer fleet looked like it was having some sort of mechanical breakdown. Ships that had moved with perfect synchronization for centuries were now operating independently. Their shared consciousness fragmented as different parts of the collective tried to solve different pieces of what they assumed was an incredibly sophisticated human strategy. The reality was both simpler and more complex. Hayes wasn't implementing some master plan so much as conducting controlled chaos, using principles borrowed from ancient Earth naval warfare where individual ship captains had to think independently because communication across a fleet took hours rather than microseconds. All ships, Hayes broadcast, his voice carrying across the human fleet with the calm authority of someone who had just realized that the impossible might be merely improbable. Implement Nelson Protocol, break their lines, force individual engagements and trust your instinct. Show them what humans do when the plan stops working. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for the next century, though most of the analysts would conclude that it shouldn't have worked. Human ships, individually outgunned and technologically inferior, somehow managed to turn a massive enemy formation into a confused melee where superior numbers became a liability rather than an asset. Devourer vessels, designed for coordinated fleet actions, found themselves in knife-fight engagements where their technological advantages meant little against human crews who had learned to think independently when everything went wrong, which Hayes reflected as he watched another enemy formation dissolve into chaos, was pretty much the human condition in a nutshell. The aftermath of the battle looked like someone had taken a perfectly organized jigsaw puzzle and fed it through a blender set to cosmic catastrophe. Devourer vessels drifted through space in various states of damage and confusion, their perfect crystalline hulls scarred by weapons that shouldn't have been able to penetrate their shields, and their collective consciousness apparently suffering from the galactic equivalent of a migraine. Of the 12,000 ships that had approached Helix Prime with mathematical certainty, fewer than 3,000 remained operational. The rest had either been destroyed, disabled, or in several cases that would puzzle xenobiologists for decades, had apparently decided to surrender, despite belonging to a species that had never demonstrated the concept of surrender in their entire recorded history. The human fleet, meanwhile, hung in space with the casual disarray of a group that had just finished an impromptu party. 68 ships had somehow managed to defeat an enemy force nearly 200 times their size, and most of the crews were still trying to figure out how they were still alive to contemplate this mathematical impossibility. "Sir," reported Ensign Park, her voice carrying the shell-shocked tone of someone who had just witnessed physics, "apologize for an inconvenience. Admiral Cortex is requesting immediate communication. Priority Alpha." Hayes nodded, straightening his uniform with the sort of careful attention to detail that suggested he was still processing the fact that he hadn't been vaporized in the first 10 minutes of combat. "Put him through." The holographic display shimmered to life, revealing Admiral Cortex's four-eyed visage wearing an expression that cycled through disbelief, confusion, and what might have been the early stages of a nervous breakdown. Behind him, the Institute's war room buzzed with activity as analysts frantically tried to process battle data that violated several fundamental laws of military science. "Cadet Hayes," the Admiral began, then paused as his processors apparently reminded him that the traditional forms of address might need updating. "Commander Hayes, your tactical performance has been..." Hayes smiled with the modest expression of someone who had just accidentally reinvented warfare while trying to pass a particularly difficult exam. "Thank you, sir. Though I should point out that most of the credit belongs to my crew. They adapted to unconventional tactics with remarkable flexibility." "Unconventional," Admiral Cortex repeated,
his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to find polite words for completely insane. Yes, that's one way to describe. In the background, Commander Zektiva could be seen running battle simulations, with the desperate intensity of someone whose entire worldview had just been subjected to aggressive renovation. His cybernetic implants flickered as they processed tactical data that refused to make sense according to any established parameters. "Sir," Zektiva interrupted, his voice carrying the strained quality of artificial intelligence, experiencing an existential crisis. "The enemy's tactical algorithms appear to have suffered complete systemic failure. Their collective consciousness fragmented when faced with what they interpreted as, I'm reading this correctly, aggressive nonsense." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Hive minds optimize for efficiency against rational opponents. When faced with tactics that appear irrational but are actually based on principles they don't understand, they overcomplicate their response until they paralyze themselves. And these principles, Admiral Cortex prompted, his four eyes focusing with the intensity of someone who suspected the answer might rewrite every military manual in the galaxy. Ancient human naval warfare, specifically the principle that when facing superior numbers, you force your enemy to fight you piecemeal rather than allowing them to coordinate their advantage. Nelson used it at Trafalgar, cutting the combined Franco-Spanish fleet into segments. The concept applies remarkably well to space combat, when you account for the three-dimensional nature of the engagement space. The silence that followed was the sort of profound quiet that occurs when several centuries of military doctrine realize they might need to update their resume. Commander Zektiva's optical sensors actually dimmed as his processors struggled to reconcile advanced galactic warfare with something called Nelson Protocol. "You're telling me," Admiral Cortex said slowly, "that you defeated a technologically superior enemy fleet using tactics developed by primitives fighting with wooden ships powered by wind?" "Well," Hayes replied with the diplomatic tone of someone trying to explain quantum physics to a particularly skeptical child, "when you put it like that, it does sound a bit unlikely." The next few hours brought a parade of communications from across the galaxy, as news of the battle spread through military channels like gossip through a small town. The Vorthek High Command requested detailed tactical analyses, their collective processing power struggling to understand how mathematical certainty had been defeated by what their computers insisted on classifying as organized random. The Zalari Collective sent a diplomatic mission to study human chaos theory, apparently convinced that humans had developed some sort of advanced probability manipulation technology. Their shared consciousness found the concept of individual initiative so foreign that they assumed it must be the result of sophisticated artificial intelligence. The Korath warrior clans meanwhile declared Hayes an honorary battle brother, and immediately began incorporating human unpredictability training into their military academies. This mostly involved telling their cadets to ignore their instincts and do something stupid instead, which resulted in a brief period of tactical confusion before their instructors figured out that human unpredictability couldn't be taught, it had to be genuine. Perhaps the most telling response came from the academy itself, where Hayes's former classmates found themselves studying recordings of the battle with the same obsessive intensity he had once devoted to ancient human military history. The tactics that had earned him dead last ranking in his class were now being dissected by the same professors who had dismissed them as primitive nonsense. Professor Ilthara, the Zalari whose collective wisdom had once pronounced Hayes's strategies fundamentally flawed, submitted a formal request to add human historical military theory to the Academy's required curricula. The irony of this was not lost on Hayes, who received the news while reviewing requests from 17 different military academies asking him to serve as a guest lecturer. Commander Zektiva, meanwhile, had apparently suffered some sort of philosophical crisis, and was last seen in the Academy library frantically studying the same ancient human texts that Hayes had been reading. His cybernetic implants kept overheating whenever he tried to process the concept of intuitive tactics, leading to several embarrassing incidents involving smoke and emergency shutdown protocols. The wider galaxy's response was equally dramatic. Human vessels, previously considered obsolete curiosities suitable only for museum displays and nostalgic collectors, suddenly found themselves in high demand. Several alien governments quietly inquired about purchasing human-built ships, apparently convinced that there was some secret military advantage built into their primitive design philosophy. The truth, of course, was much simpler and infinitely more complex. Human ships worked because they were built by a species that had never quite mastered the art of perfect coordination, a species that had learned to fight wars with commanders who couldn't communicate instantly across vast distances, who had to trust their subordinates to make decisions independently when the plan inevitably went wrong. 6 months later, Hayes found himself standing in the same Academy war room, where Admiral Cortex had first contemplated the impossible task of stopping the Devourer fleet. This time, however, he was wearing the uniform of a full admiral, and the holographic displays showed human tactical principles being incorporated into fleet doctrines across the galaxy. Sir, reported his aide, a young Vorthek officer, who had requested transfer to human command after determining that predictable tactics were insufficient for optimal career advancement. The latest intelligence reports suggest that several enemy species are attempting to develop counter-strategies for human unpredictability. Hayes smiled, the same expression that had once worried his bridge crew during the battle that made him famous. How's that working out for? Not well, sir. Apparently artificial unpredictability is still predictable. They're creating random number generators to simulate human tactical decisions, but the results are unsatisfactory. Of course they were. True unpredictability couldn't be programmed or calculated. It emerged from the beautiful chaotic intersection of individual initiative, incomplete information, and the peculiarly human tendency to try impossible things just to see what would happen. The galaxy's greatest military minds continued to study the Battle of Helix Prime, searching for the secret formula that had allowed an obsolete human fleet to achieve the impossible. They built models, ran simulations, and wrote extensively about controlled chaos theory and tactical uncertainty principles. They were missing the point, but Hayes didn't mind. After all, the best part about being unpredictable was that it only worked as long as nobody could figure out how you did it, and since humans themselves barely understood how they did it, the galaxy's military academies would be studying the problem for centuries to come, which was fine by Hayes, who had moved on to reading about ancient human siege warfare and wondering if there were any interesting applications for something called psychological warfare in the context of interstellar diplomacy. The math still said it should have been impossible, but the math had learned to be more careful about what it declared impossible when humans were involved.